Again, FEMA says they have evidence of a severe high-temperature corrosion attack on the steel, including oxidation, sulfidation. A liquid eutectic mixture containing primarily iron, oxygen, sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on steel. No clear explanation of the source of the sulfur has been identified. Did they look at thermate? No. Chemical analysis is clear. Intergranular melting. By the way, fire does not produce intergranular melting. That is to say, normal office fires or even jet fuel-inspired fires. A 1-inch column being reduced to half-inch thickness, its edges, which are curled like a paper scroll, having been thinned to almost razor sharpness, gaping holes, some larger than a silver dollar. Did fire do this to steel? No physicist will say yes.
Steel in dragon-like lengths and contortions spoke for itself, bent, deformed, without cracks.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
Typically, you'd have buckling and tearing on the tension side, but there's no buckling at all. There's no buckling at all.
Well, some of this previously molten steel was sent to Stephen Jones at BYU for analysis. He's a physicist, and what did he find? Well, first of all, he says if thermite reaction was used to ignite a fire, they produce a characteristic burn pattern. This is well known by fire investigators. It would contain more unusual elements like fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. So he knew what to look for. So the previously molten metal is predominantly iron, so we can rule out aluminum from the jet planes. It has very little chromium, so we can rule out molten structural steel. It's primarily iron, not steel. This is very important because the byproduct of thermate reaction is not steel, it's iron, molten iron. The previously molten metal has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, potassium. The telltale signature of thermite, and manganese and fluorine in abundance, also used in thermite charges. And the second sample from the slag from this memorial at Clarkston University sent to Stephen Jones, this piece right here, he did X-ray fluorescence and also showed fluorine, sulfur, manganese, potassium. Now, if gel explosives were used, we'd expect to see, well, gel explosives are tiny aluminum particles in iron oxide, and they can be cast into shape because they're like a gel. They're not just powder. And they produce a very high density and extremely powerful charge. So they're put into linear cutting devices like this, where you see the round circle being the sol gel, and the vertical element that's hatched is the structural steel element. So you'd see something like this in a thermite linear shaped cutting charge, which is indeed from the World Trade Center steel, in fact, building number 7. But sol gels would hold that thermite would leave a telltale residue. In this case, with sol gels, 1,3-diphenylpropane. Diphenylpropane. An analysis that Dr. Jones did on the WTC steel finds, indeed, there's 1,3-diphenylpropane. In fact, it's corroborated by the EPA. What do they say? One molecule described by the EPA's Eric Schwartz was present at levels that dwarfed all others. 1,3-diphenylpropane. We've never observed it in any other sampling that we've done. Well, that's not all. The dust that was sent to him from an apartment gathered by Jeanette McKinley in a plastic bag and sent to Stephen Jones, he put a magnet over it. It was the first thing he did. He's looking for metallic objects in the World Trade Center dust. Remember, it blanketed Manhattan 4 inches thick. 0.1% about rose up to the magnet. What in the world could that be? Well, he found, first of all, that all of it was spherical, up to the size almost of a BB, or a 1/16 of an inch. which is very curious. He did a chemical analysis on it, and he finds all the telltale signs, once again, of thermite. How did they get round? Well, the only hypothesis that's reasonable is that the thermite cutting charge produces the molten iron. A fraction of a second later, the explosives atomize it, sending it and all the beams way out, and it gets so small due to the explosives that it forms itself into a sphere due to the surface tension, just like a raindrop does, and it cools as it comes through the air, and it falls on the cars, and I'll show you how it corrodes all of the cars surrounding. It's the primary source of corrosion, the only one that most of us can think of. And the EPA found the same spheres and the same chemical makeup that Dr. Jones did. This is all corroborated. Now, you have to deal with this physical evidence. You can't go away and say, I didn't quite hear to my satisfaction that these buildings were blown up. Unless you rationally deal with every one of these, or the people you're talking to tell you the same, they have to rationally deal with everything that we in the 9/11 Truth Movement are saying about this physical evidence about the controlled demolition. These thousands of them corroded on the tops, not the sides, not from the explosions, but from some corrosive element, such as thermite, settling on them. Manganese is also found by the city's chief examiner in surrounding buildings, a highly toxic substance, again, a telltale sign of thermite. So, Dr. Jones's conclusions, and two other physicists and a geologist, are that with all of this iron, fluorine, manganese, aluminum, sulfur, and barium 1,3-diphenyl propane, that indeed thermite was used deliberately placed in both the World Trade Center towers and Building 7. Okay? Is there dust clouds? Enormous, thick, billowing. This is what buildings look like when they fall over. This is what the World Trade Center looks like.
One of the most significant things to my thinking that indicates that this could not have been the sort of collapse that we are told it was is the presence of the dust clouds. And as you've seen in the pictures, and I'm sure all of us have seen probably more than we would like, there were very, very large clouds of very thick dust that enveloped the area, that crossed the river, that made it almost all the way to New Jersey.
You can see the building pulverizing itself to dust in the first couple of seconds. We're not talking about the kinetic energy of a 40-story or a 20-story building. There's no kinetic energy developed, or very little, in the first second. The explosions are the kinetic energy that creates the dust. And that's 100-micron dust, the width of a human hair. What mechanism is required to turn 90,000 tons of concrete into dust, most of which is the width of a human hair? There's no concrete left, no large macroscopic chunks of concrete blanketing downtown Manhattan. What about the people? Fewer than 300 whole bodies were found. 1,100 victims remain unidentified. 800 victims identified by DNA alone. Nearly 20,000 pieces of bodies found. 6,000 small enough to fit into test tubes. 200 matched to a single person. One person blown to 200 different pieces. Can a gravitational force explain that? Nearly 10,000 unidentified pieces frozen for future identification. And 1,000 victims never identified. And don't forget those 700 bone fragments, a half an inch long, at the top of the Deutsche Bank building that they just found.